Babylon, 17 centuries before Christ. Beneath the ziggurat's shadow, torches burned like eyes that never blinked. The soldiers had returned from war, but no one in the city called it peace. The priests spoke of gratitude, the generals of loyalty, and the wives of Babylon were told they would become offerings, not to the gods, but to the men who ruled in their name. It was called devotion, it was called honor. And in the heart of that ancient empire, obedience was carved deeper than love. Her name was Tia, daughter of a merchant, wife of a soldier. She had not seen her husband, Naram, for 7 moons. When the army returned, she watched from her rooftop as they marched beneath the crimson banners of Marduk, their shields glinting like the scales of a serpent. The city roared for them, but Tia saw no joy in their faces, only exhaustion and dread. They had won against Elam, but every Babylonian victory carried a hidden price. The priests called it the Law of Offering, a decree older than the city's walls. Each soldier, upon returning home, was required to dedicate his most loyal possession to the gods through his superior officer. Some offered cattle, others slaves, but those deemed most faithful gave their wives. The tablets found in the temple archives still describe it. Let what is dearest to the warrior be given unto his lord, that no heart may love above the king. That evening, the streets filled with smoke and hymns. Soldiers lined the temple stairs as priestesses anointed the air with frankincense. Naram stood among them, his head bowed, his hands shaking. The general's voice carried over the crowd, measured, holy, unyielding. Babylon endures through obedience, he said. The gods favor the loyal. Behind him the wives were led forward, their faces painted in ash and lapis. Tia's veil brushed the stone steps. The night was thick with silence, except for the rhythm of her sandals. She looked at Naram once, but his eyes were fixed on the ground. He had become part of the ritual now, as trapped as she was. Inside the temple, the air was heavy and hot. The walls shimmered with gold reliefs of gods who never blinked. The women were told they were to bless the generals, to carry the victory into the next generation. None of them spoke. The sound of metal and breath filled the space. The sound of devotion turned to duty. By dawn, the city would celebrate again. The generals would feast. The priests would record the blessings on clay. The men would call themselves pure, and the women would be left with silence, sacred, binding, and eternal. Outside, the ziggurat's shadow stretched across the city like a hand. In its palm, Babylon slept, dreaming of glory, while its daughters learned what loyalty truly meant. Tia awoke before dawn. The city was quiet, its streets still heavy with incense and the faint echo of drums from the night before. Her body ached as if it had been pressed beneath stone, though no mark showed on her skin. Outside, the air was dry and pale. The Tigris shimmered beyond the walls, carrying the sound of oars and distant shouting. In the courtyard, her husband stood washing his hands in a basin of bronze. He did not look at her. Neither spoke. The silence between them felt like the weight of a sealed tablet, something written long ago that neither could change. Babylon did not belong to its people. It belonged to its laws, and those laws were older than mercy. When Naram finally turned, his eyes were hollow, rimmed in red. "The general has chosen me for another campaign," he said quietly. "We leave before dusk." The words were meant as duty, but they landed like a confession. He was leaving because it was easier than facing what he had done. Tia wanted to ask if the gods had truly required her, if the priests would ever be satisfied, if Babylon would ever stop asking for what could not be returned. But she had been raised to know that questions were not a woman's right. She only nodded. Her mouth formed the shape of a blessing, though no sound came. The market below was already alive with movement. Women carried baskets of barley and figs. Boys chased goats through the alleys. Life in Babylon never stopped to mourn. The temple stood above them all, its terraced crown catching the first light of morning. Smoke still drifted from its summit, curling into the sky like a whisper no one dared to interrupt. Tia walked past it, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. A priest passed her, his hands stained with oil, murmuring prayers that tasted of iron. She wondered how many women before her had walked this same path, heads lowered, hearts folded into silence. The clay tablets in the temple archives recorded the names of kings, generals, and priests. never the names of wives. Yet it was the wives who bore the empire's quiet sacrifices, who turned their grief into the soil that fed Babylon's glory. When night came again, Naram kissed her forehead once, a gesture practiced and hollow. He left his bow by the door, its curve gleaming like the moon. Then he was gone, swallowed by the sound of marching feet and the roar of soldiers drunk on faith. Tia stood in the doorway until the torches disappeared into the distance. In the darkness, she pressed her palms to the ground and whispered a prayer, not to Marduk or Ishtar, but to whatever god might still pity the forgotten. The wind answered softly through the reeds. Far above, the ziggurat glowed faintly in the moonlight, like an altar that would never cool, and somewhere inside it, her silence was still being offered. The temple smelled of cedar smoke and myrrh. Its walls were painted with gods who stared down at the living as if judging their worth. Tia had not entered since the night of the offering, yet now the priestesses summoned her again. They told her it was to give thanks for the favor her husband had earned in war, though she knew it was only to remind her of what had been taken. The floor was cool beneath her bare feet, polished smooth by centuries of devotion. Around her, women knelt in quiet rows, their faces hidden by thin veils of blue linen. Some prayed aloud, their voices trembling like reeds. Others simply stared at the floor, lips unmoving, eyes empty. A priest walked between them with a bronze bowl of oil, marking each forehead with a circle meant to purify. When he reached Tia, his fingers lingered for a moment too long. The oil smelled sweet, but it burned against her skin. She closed her eyes and saw the night again, the torches, the chanting, the laughter that did not sound human. The sound had followed her home, into her dreams, into her silence. She wanted to scrape the memory from her body, but the city did not allow forgetting. Every morning the temple bells reminded her of devotion. Every night, the prayers whispered from the ziggurat walls told her that what had happened was sacred. In Babylon, pain was not cruelty, it was worship. The priest said a woman's suffering pleased the gods because it mirrored the patience of the earth, always receiving, never refusing. When the ritual ended, Tia was given a small clay tablet stamped with the seal of the temple. It named her a vessel of favor, a title that allowed her to live among the honored women of the city. She almost laughed at the irony. The other women bowed as she passed, not out of respect, but fear. They looked at her as one marked, as someone who had walked too close to the gods and returned half-burned. Outside, the heat pressed against her like a hand. She walked through the market, where the cries of merchants mixed with the sound of livestock. A slave girl offered her water, eyes lowered, voice trembling. Tia thanked her softly. The girl could not have been more than 12. She wondered if, in a few years, that same child would be painted in ash and lapis, called loyal, called sacred. As the sun sank, Tia looked toward the horizon. The city glowed gold and red, beautiful and merciless. From the riverbank she could see the army's banners moving farther away, a long serpent of bronze and dust. Somewhere in that line was Naram, carrying his guilt like a shield. She pressed the temple tablet to her chest, feeling its weight. It was small, fragile, and heavy as a tombstone. She whispered, not to the gods, but to the women beside her, unseen, unheard. "We are all offerings," she said. The wind carried the words away, but Babylon always listened. The summer passed in silence. Babylon thrived as it always had, its walls shimmering like sunlit brass, its ziggurat reaching into a sky that never seemed to end. Merchants returned to the gates with caravans of cedar and gold. Priests sang of victory, of divine favor, of the city chosen by the gods. But within its courtyards and narrow streets, a quieter truth spread. The wives of soldiers began to vanish from the marketplaces, taken for new offerings after each campaign. No one spoke of it directly, yet everyone knew. To question was to blaspheme, and blasphemy was punished not by death, but by shame, a slower, crueler burial. Tia lived within that silence. She spent her days weaving by the doorway, her fingers moving mechanically through the thread, her mind drifting somewhere beyond the walls. Each night, she heard the priests chanting from the temple, praising the loyalty of Babylon's men. The words echoed through the alleys like smoke, rising and twisting until they lost their meaning. One evening, As the sun bled into the western horizon, a messenger arrived. His robes were dusted with ash, his face streaked with salt and fear. He brought word from the front. Naram's unit had fallen in the valley of Susa. The general lived. The soldiers did not. Tia felt the world tilt for a moment, then steady again. The news did not bring tears, only stillness. She had lost him long before the war reclaimed him. The priest who delivered the message pressed a clay seal into her hand, marking her as a widow of the state. She was told that the gods would reward her through the temple's generosity, that she would not starve, that Babylon remembered its faithful. In truth, the temple's generosity was another form of control. Widows of soldiers were often summoned to serve as attendants for new generals, symbols of devotion that could not refuse their fate. That night, Tia climbed to the roof of her house. The city spread below her like a living flame, its walls flickering with torches, its air thick with prayers. She thought of the wives in the temple, kneeling, painted, erased. She thought of the river, how it swallowed everything offered to it. Flowers, ashes, bodies. She wondered if the gods ever grew weary of being fed. Somewhere in the distance, the drums began again, slow and rhythmic, announcing another victory. She closed her eyes and saw the same procession she had seen a dozen times before. The soldiers returning, the priests waiting, the wives watching from the rooftops. The city never changed, only the names of those it consumed. At dawn, she walked to the riverbank, her hands empty. The sky above Babylon glowed with soft gold, as if the city itself were burning from within. The priests would tell her to find comfort in ritual, to serve as she had been chosen to serve. But as the first light touched the water, she understood. The gods of Babylon were not cruel. They were only mirrors, reflecting the faces of the men who worshipped them. The summons came at twilight. 2 temple guards stood at Tia's door, their bronze helmets catching the last light of day. They spoke her name with a formality that felt like mockery. She was to report to the ziggurat at moonrise, chosen for service under the High General's household. Service, they called it, though everyone in Babylon knew what it meant. The city had many words for obedience, each one polished to sound sacred. She was not afraid anymore, only hollow. The years of silence had stripped her of fear the way wind wears away stone. She wrapped herself in a plain linen shawl, tied her hair in a knot, and followed the guards through the narrow streets. The city was quiet, yet alive. The smell of smoke, the faint laughter of drunk soldiers, the steady rhythm of sandals on dust. Babylon always watched its own cruelty without blinking. At the temple gates, the priestesses waited. Their faces were painted in gold and ash, their movements graceful, rehearsed. They anointed Tia's forehead with oil and led her inside. The walls of the ziggurat rose around her, smooth and immense, carved with lines of cuneiform prayers that told of conquest and gratitude. She had once believed those words to be holy. Now they looked like chains. The High General stood at the altar, flanked by priests who chanted praises to Marduk, to Ishtar, to the strength of empire. His armor gleamed beneath the torchlight, polished by hands that did not belong to him. When his gaze found Tia, he smiled the way men do when they see possession rather than person. The ceremony was brief. A priest read from a tablet, declaring her consecrated to service through widowhood. The words meant she no longer belonged to herself. When the chant ended, she was presented with a small bronze bracelet, its surface etched with the symbol of the temple. It was said to protect her from impurity. In truth, it marked her as property. She left the temple at dawn, the bracelet heavy on her wrist. The city below glowed with the pale fire of sunrise. From every rooftop, smoke rose in thin spirals, carrying prayers that dissolved into the wind. That morning, Tia walked through the marketplace unnoticed. To the merchants, she was another widow fulfilling her duty. To the priests, she was a living sacrifice wrapped in silence. Yet inside her chest, something began to stir, not defiance, not hope, but remembrance. She thought of the river that fed Babylon, the one that carried silt from distant lands and made the city bloom. Its current never asked permission to flow. As she watched the water shimmer beyond the walls, she pressed her hand to the bronze on her wrist. The metal was warm against her skin, as if it remembered the fire that had forged it. She whispered a single vow into the wind. No more offerings. The words vanished into the morning air. But this time, she did not bow her head. Years passed, though in Babylon time did not move, it only circled. The city still shimmered beneath the sun, still burned beneath its gods. Victories came and went like seasons. New kings, new generals, new wives offered in loyalty's name. The rituals changed only in detail, never in purpose. The law of offering endured, carved into clay tablets, pressed by hands that believed obedience would outlive death. Yet beneath the hum of devotion, something began to shift. Whispers moved through the market, through the alleys, through the women who swept the courtyards at dawn. They did not speak of rebellion, they spoke of memory. They remembered their mothers' faces, their sisters' names. The smell of rain on clay before the drums began. Even memory was dangerous in Babylon. To remember was to claim something the gods had not given, but memory spread quietly, like roots beneath stone. Tia lived on the edge of the river now. Her hair had turned the color of dust, her eyes the pale gray of smoke. She was no longer summoned to the temple, no longer watched. The priests believed her harmless, another forgotten widow living out the mercy of the gods. Yet each evening she sat by the water, carving marks into clay with a shard of bone. Not words, not names, just patterns, waves, circles, stars. She hid them beneath the reeds, letting the river carry them away. It was said that water erased what it touched, but she believed it remembered everything. One day, she thought, someone would find those fragments, and they would know. They would know what Babylon called holy, and what it destroyed in the name of that holiness. When the floods came that spring, the river swelled beyond its banks, devouring fields, washing away the edges of the city. The priests called it divine punishment for the people's weakening faith, but Tia watched from her doorway and smiled faintly. The gods of Babylon had always taken. Now, for once, they gave something back: silence to the temples, ruin to the walls that had trapped them all. She stepped into the rising water, the bronze bracelet still tight on her wrist. The current was strong, cold, endless. She thought of Naram, of the women who had walked before her, of the offerings that had kept the city standing on broken bones. The water reached her waist, then her chest. She did not resist. By dawn, the river had swallowed her house. Only the ziggurat remained above the flood, its golden tip gleaming beneath the first light. The priests would rebuild, as they always did, and carve new prayers into new stone. But beneath the surface, carried by the current, the small clay fragments drifted onward. They would travel beyond Babylon's reach, past its temples, past its laws, and someday, when the city was only ruins and dust, someone would find them and wonder whose hands had made them. In that moment, Babylon's silence would finally speak. She was never meant to be remembered. But you remember her now. If you enjoy stories like these, like and subscribe for more stories like these. And tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. I read them all.